It was raining harder than ever that night. I've always liked storms. The sound of rain helped me unwind after long days, as if it washed away the weight of the hours. Ever since I moved to this house, tucked away at the end of the street, being alone had become a habit. It was a choice. I like the silence, the peace. In the city, everything always seems too fast, like time is trying to swallow you whole. Here, in the new house, time slows down. And I like that. The living room was dimly lit, with just the light from the TV casting shadows on the walls. I had a cup of tea in my hand, something I'd picked up the habit of doing since moving here. It wasn't a big house, but it was enough for me. The furniture was still the same since I moved in, and honestly, I never cared much about decoration. I've always thought more about what's outside than inside. I was sunk into the couch, trying to focus on the movie that was playing, but I wasn't really paying attention. The storm outside was stronger than usual, the wind whistling around the corners of the house, and the rain hitting the windows like small pebbles. It was the kind of night where the noise from the outside world creeps into your mind, even if you don't want it to. That's when I noticed. The porch light flickered. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's common on nights like this for the lights to flicker a bit, especially with the wind shaking the power lines. But it was too quick to just be the wind. I kept looking at the TV, trying to ignore it, but suddenly, there was a metallic sound coming from the direction of the glass door on the porch. That made me look up. It wasn't the kind of sound the wind would make. No, it was different. I put the cup down on the side table and slowly got up, my bare feet sinking lightly into the rug. The sound repeated, softer this time, like someone was trying to open the door but couldn't. I couldn't see much through the living room window, the rain making everything blurry and distorted. I tried to steady my breathing, convincing myself it was just the wind. But the truth is, as much as I liked the silence and solitude of this house, I never really got used to the truly dark nights, especially when something seemed out of place. I walked slowly toward the glass door, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet. The dim light from the porch now illuminated only a small part of the yard, and the rain kept pouring down heavily, almost like an impenetrable curtain. As I got closer to the door, my heart started racing, and part of me wanted to believe it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But then, I saw it. A shadow moved outside. At first, I thought it might be a branch swaying in the wind, but it wasn't. It was a figure, a silhouette. Someone was there, standing right by the door, messing with the handle. I froze for a moment, not knowing what to do. What could someone possibly be doing outside in the middle of a storm? That thought raced through my mind as I stared at the dark figure, who seemed intent on getting in. My first reaction was to try and lock the door. I reached out, but as soon as I touched the latch, I realized it was broken. I'd noticed that a few days ago, but I hadn't bothered to fix it. Now, that small detail felt huge. I was vulnerable, and the only thing between me and that person outside was a thin glass door, shaking in the wind. My eyes locked on the handle, and I realized it was turning slightly, as if whoever was outside was testing to see if it was unlocked. My stomach twisted instantly, and instinct took over. I quickly left the room, trying not to make any noise, heading straight for the kitchen. I needed something to protect myself, anything. My chest rose and fell rapidly as I opened drawers, my fingers trembling slightly. I found a knife. It wasn't big, but it was sharp enough. I gripped the handle tightly as I crouched near the counter, listening to the sound of the glass door rattling. The storm kept roaring outside, but the noises inside the house no longer blended with the rain. The intruder was coming in. The sound of the glass opening was muffled by the rain. My entire body was tense as I heard wet footsteps entering the living room. Every drop that fell from the intruder onto the wooden floor seemed to echo louder than the storm outside. I crouched further behind the counter, doing my best to control my breathing. My fingers still gripped the knife tightly, but my mind was racing in all directions. What was I supposed to do? The footsteps echoed closer, firm and slow. He was walking through the room, maybe assessing the surroundings, maybe looking for me. Every sound he made heightened the pressure inside me. I knew he was searching for me, knew that at some point, he would find me. Then, in the middle of that tense silence, I made a mistake. The knife slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the kitchen. The intruder stopped immediately. My heart raced. It felt as if time had frozen for a moment. He knew where I was. And I knew I didn't have any more time. The footsteps started again, now faster, heading toward me. I couldn't think of anything else but to get up and face whatever was coming. There was no way to escape without being seen. I grabbed the knife from the floor and stood up in one swift motion, my legs trembling but determined to do something. And there he was. His eyes, hidden by the shadow of a soaked hood, met mine. He paused for a moment, as if surprised that I had stood up. It was just a fraction of a second, but it was enough for me to brace myself for whatever came next. Without thinking twice, I took advantage of that split second and bolted toward the back door. I heard his footsteps restart behind me, faster and more determined. The sound of heavy boots hitting the kitchen floor echoed alongside my own panic. I flung the back door open, and the storm's wind hit me with a cold, wet blast, but I didn't stop. I ran through the soaked yard, my feet sinking into the mud with every step. The world around me blurred, rain, darkness, the deafening roar of the storm. I didn't look back, I couldn't. My lungs were burning, the air felt thick and hard to breathe, but I knew the only thing that mattered was to keep running. I slipped once, almost face-planting into the ground, but I caught my balance and kept going. There was no time to waste. I knew he was behind me, and my only chance was to reach the neighbor's house, even though it was a little ways off. The house's lights were barely visible through the rain, but that was my hope. With every step I took, the mud and water made it harder to move forward, but I couldn't stop. Finally, I reached the neighbor's door and started pounding on it desperately. My hands were shaking, and I could barely form a coherent thought. I just wanted someone to answer. Seconds felt like hours until the door opened, and a wave of relief hit me all at once. I rushed inside, breathless, drenched, and exhausted, but alive. As I tried to catch my breath and explain what had happened, the storm outside raged on, almost as if reminding me that, though I had escaped, the night was far from over. The intruder might be far away, but the sense of vulnerability, that would stay with me for a long time. That stormy night seemed perfect for relaxing. The rain was pouring hard, hitting the windows, while the wind whistled through the cracks, but inside, everything was fine. I had settled on the couch with a blanket and a hot cup of coffee, watching one of my favorite movies. I've always loved the sound of rain, especially when I'm comfortably at home, and that was the perfect soundtrack for the night. The occasional thunder interrupted the sound of the TV. But honestly, it only made the atmosphere even more pleasant. The room was softly lit by the glow of the television, and the shadows of the trees outside danced on the walls every time lightning streaked across the sky. Outside, it seemed chaotic with the wind and rain, but in here, I was calm, enjoying every second of the storm. Between scenes, I could hear the sound of water running through the gutters and the crackle of branches being dragged across the ground. It wasn't the kind of night to go out, but to be exactly where I was. That felt like the perfect plan for a rainy night, movie, coffee, and the sound of the storm. In the middle of the movie, a louder clap of thunder shook the windows, and I let out a short laugh, thinking about how intense the storm was getting. I grabbed the remote to turn up the volume a bit, as the sound of the rain was starting to drown out the TV. As I tried to refocus on the screen, something different caught my attention. It was a repetitive sound, a light tapping coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a window that hadn't been fully shut, but the noise continued. I paused the movie and sat in silence for a few seconds. The heavy rain was already making a lot of noise, but that specific sound stood out, something like a tap-tap, always in the same rhythm. I frowned and got up, still thinking it could be a poorly closed window or something in the yard being moved by the wind. Walking down the hallway toward the kitchen, the sound became clearer. Probably the wind, I thought, but even so, I went to check. As I approached the window, the noise got more distinct. Outside, the rain poured down the glass in streams, but something was off with the window. It was tapping lightly against the frame, which was odd because I was sure I had closed it earlier. With a quick motion, I tried to shut it completely. I closed the window with a soft click, thinking the problem was solved. But as I looked more closely, I noticed that some water droplets had already pooled on the floor, trickling down from the glass. It struck me as odd because, despite the storm, the window hadn't been open enough to let that much water in. I ran my hand along the frame, trying to figure out how that had happened. Still holding my phone's flashlight, I illuminated the corner of the kitchen. The light flickered on the reflection of the water pooling on the floor. At that moment, a quick thought flashed through my mind, but the noise of the rain and thunder drowned out any clear reasoning. I gave the window another look, as if to reassure myself that there was nothing outside but the chaotic storm. I shut the window more firmly and turned to leave the kitchen, but then I heard it again. That same light, almost rhythmic sound, only this time it didn't seem to be coming from the window anymore. I stopped for a second to listen more carefully. It was coming from inside the house, farther away, maybe from the living room or another room. That's when it hit me, the wind could explain the window noise, but what I was hearing now was different. It was as if someone was slowly, deliberately, moving something, trying not to make too much noise. A faint sense of unease crept over me. I grabbed the flashlight again and, this time, turned off the kitchen lights to try and listen more closely. I stood still for a moment, alert. The noise persisted, but softer now, more subtle. I stood still for a moment, holding the flashlight, as the soft, rhythmic sound continued. That small unease, which had been just a mild discomfort, started to grow. It's probably something falling over, I thought, trying to find a quick explanation. But the truth was, it was becoming harder to ignore. It was different from anything the wind or storm could cause. I walked back to the living room, moving slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, not sure why, but it felt like I was trying not to disturb the silence. The shadows in the room seemed bigger now, dancing with the beam of the flashlight. The sound was closer, almost like someone rummaging through furniture, opening drawers. I stopped at the entrance of the living room, scanning the space, trying to pinpoint exactly where the noise was coming from. The rain was still hammering the windows, but the sound that was bothering me now was more subtle. My eyes scanned every corner of the room, analyzing every detail. That's when I saw it. The living room window, the one that faced the backyard, was slightly ajar. The curtain, soaked from the rain, swayed gently with the wind, but the strange thing was that window should have been closed as well. My breathing grew heavier, and the noise from the kitchen now seemed to echo from other rooms as well. It was as if something, or someone, was moving through the house, and I couldn't tell exactly where or what it was. Instinctively, I turned off the flashlight, backed away from the window, and hid behind the couch, waiting in silence. Behind the couch, I stayed as still as possible. The storm outside kept roaring, but the sound inside the house was now my biggest concern. I could hear soft, almost muffled footsteps, but they were there. The person, or whatever it was, seemed to be moving carefully, as if they knew exactly where to step to avoid making noise. My hands were sweaty, and I gripped the flashlight tightly, trying to figure out what to do next. Every movement outside the room felt closer, more deliberate. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the hallway or another room, but I knew I wasn't alone. The sound of drawers being opened and objects being moved mixed with the rain, and I had to focus hard to separate the two. The intruder was looking for something, and I was trapped there, with no clear plan. The only thought keeping me frozen in place was the fear of being discovered. Any wrong move, any sound, could give me away. I didn't dare turn the flashlight back on. Staying hidden seemed like the only viable option at that moment. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, inching toward me with every second. And then, the sound stopped. A heavy silence filled the room for a moment, and I stayed there, waiting, not knowing what would come next. The silence lasted longer than I expected, as if the intruder was standing still, contemplating the next move. I stayed crouched behind the couch, trying to control my breathing. Each second felt like it stretched on forever. Then, a distant sound broke the tension, a siren in the distance. The noise seemed to catch the intruder's attention. Suddenly, the footsteps became hurried. He was no longer concerned with being quiet. The sound of drawers and furniture being rummaged through stopped, replaced by the quick pace of footsteps heading toward the door. My muscles began to relax, but the fear still clung to me. The front door was flung open and then slammed shut with force, the sound muted by the storm. I stayed still for a few more moments, trying to convince myself that he had truly left. Only when silence returned did I allow myself to take a deep breath. I slowly stood up, my legs still shaky. The house seemed finally quiet again, but something had changed. The storm's sound returned to dominate the atmosphere, but I couldn't feel the same sense of comfort it had brought before.